Did you know that the god Apollo was actually planned for Hades from very early on, only to be scrapped later? The game files even include an icon and some kind of beam ability in the code, maybe similar to the beams that Hades fires in his fight. Hello, my name's Haelian, and today we're going to talk about cut content in Hades. There is a massive amount of boons, hammer upgrades, keepsakes, items, and more that never made it into the final version of Hades. These could be things that were included in the early access versions of the game but got scrapped later, or maybe an unfinished idea that got left in the code for us to discover now. There is a lot to cover, so let's dive into it. So Apollo could have been planned to be added after Demeter in the long winter update, but was ultimately scrapped because, well, who knows really. If I were to guess, it was probably just too much to add on top of everything else that they had planned for the game at that point. We don't really have any other information other than this icon and a few small lines of code. But if you're interested in seeing what Apollo could have been like, I highly suggest checking out the Olympus Extra mod. The creators of this mod did an amazing job bringing Apollo and Hestia to Hades with a full suite of boons, animations, dialogue, and more. Check the description if you want more info on that mod. Do you ever get the feeling that Charon's shop is missing something? You see, there is just one tiny typo in the code that is preventing us from being offered nectars and even onions from the shop in each run. The onion is supposed to be super rare though, and only appears after using an Erebus gate. This is essentially the only unintended piece of content that got left out of the game that we could find, and I think I'm okay with it being left behind, but it was kind of interesting to see. But there are lots of unused ideas left in the code of the game, so much so that we couldn't really cover them all in just this one video. For instance, there are several well items that got left behind, including one that would guarantee having Thanatos summoned later on. There's also an item that would stop crushers from spawning in Asphodel, similar to Flame Wheel Release in Elysium. I kind of like the idea of guaranteeing Thanatos when I want, but I could probably do without the crusher release. One of the coolest ideas that got left behind is an entire weapon aspect, known only as Beam Bow in the community. There isn't a lot known about its origins, but it's one of the more fleshed out pieces of content that never made it to release. With Beam Bow on, your bow attack shoots out in rapid fire bursts, dealing small amounts of damage each. Maybe kind of like Delta Chamber for the rail, but the animation has more of a piercing beam look to it. I played a bit with it and got some juicy Athena boons and triple shot for the bow, but it didn't feel great honestly. It probably would have been a lot better with Zeus or Dionysus on the attack given the rapid fire nature. It's possible that this was a precursor to the rail, so they formed some animations and ideas that attached to the bow to test it out before making a whole new weapon. Or it was just a kooky weapon aspect idea for the bow that eventually got dropped. I think I'm okay with missing out on this potential aspect just because I really love all of the weapon aspects for the bow already, and I feel like the rail fills in the archetype pretty well. But you gotta admit, it's pretty damn cool looking, right? Here are some of the more interesting boon ideas that got left behind in the code as well. There's a boon that we think could have belonged to Poseidon that would reduce the amount of enemies seen in each chamber by 20%, kind of a reverse jury summons. There are also several boons that mention stunning enemies. Poseidon has one for when slamming an enemy against a wall, and Artemis has one that would stun enemies when you deal a crit to them. Ares also has this really interesting idea for a boon that would make the doom effect spread to other enemies nearby, although it's unclear if it's on an enemy death or some other way. I kinda think this boon would have been great for Ares' arsenal and would have been a great form of crowd controller AoE. Plenty of keepsake ideas were left behind as well. There's one that looks like it would have used 5 health in order to throw out a cast, assumingly giving you much more cast ammo but at a high price. There's another keepsake that just gives you 1 darkness for each chamber you enter. It's not clear what exactly was planned for it, but 1 darkness per chamber isn't the most generous, so maybe it could snowball into giving extra in later biomes. There was actually a hammer still in the game that got cut during early access but can still be attained using the Codex mod, Concentrated Fire for the rail. It increases your attack's damage for each consecutive shot, allowing you to ramp it up. This style of hammer with the ramping damage was actually a really common idea, and pretty much every weapon had one at some point, but most didn't make it into the final version of the game. And there are a lot more hammer ideas that are in the game, but were never fully finished. Cooling chamber for the rail would have restored 3 bullets to your clip every time you dash. Charged knuckle for the fist would allow you to charge your attack and deal a power shot if timed correctly. Peerless parry for the shield would return some of the damage you block back to the enemies. The list goes on and on, honestly, and we just can't get to all of them. Something else really cool that got left in the game is a Doom Flare style boon from Ares for when you're using the aspect of Beowulf, and maybe Hera too. Using mods, we're able to see how this cast plays out with Beowulf, and I gotta say, it's actually a lot of fun. So the AoE that applies the Doom is absolutely massive, which helps with large groups of enemies, and the Doom damage scales up really fast with palms. So I was able to get some really big numbers with it. I mean, just watch how fast this heroes fight goes when the Doom is hitting for over 700 a pop. We're not sure why this was even made, since Slicing Shot had been in the game since conception and Beowulf was added much later. It's possible Supergiant considered using this as Ares' cast with Beowulf over Slicing Flare, since Slicing Flare is, interesting. It's too bad, because I actually really liked this boon, and it's interesting to think about what the game would have been like if we got Doom Flare instead of Slicing Flare, or maybe if both were an option. I don't know. What do you think? Now, because Hades was in early access for almost 2 years, there is a ton of content that was present in that time but was dropped later. As the game evolved, some things became obsolete and were replaced. Others just didn't work very well in testing and thus were removed. For instance, before the duo boon Calculated Risk existed, there was a duo boon between Athena and Dionysus called Smokescreen. This duo made the festive fog from Trippy Shot deflective and would protect you from projectiles while standing in it. This gave Trippy Shot 3 exclusive duo boons, with Ice Wine and Scintillating Feast being the others. This boon was not very helpful, as you can imagine, since it really only protected you from projectiles. That and the fact that Trippy Shot now had 3 duo boons for itself probably convinced the devs to go in another direction with the Athena Dio duo. Also, before Cold Embrace existed, there was a slightly different duo boon between Aphrodite and Demeter called the Love Triangle. You'd drop a crystal beam that would fire 3 separate beams, but the beams moved much slower and always started really spread out before trying to focus in on a target. Now, I know Cold Embrace is far from the best boon in the game, but let me assure you, this old duo boon sucked. The crystals would disappear before they even start hitting most enemies, so it was just impossible to deal a meaningful amount of damage to anything that you didn't manage to get to sit on top of the crystal. But it was pretty fun to watch, I have to admit. Crystal Clarity already existed at this point, so there was definitely no reason to use Love Triangle. I'm guessing player feedback convinced them to change it up, and we got Cold Embrace instead, which I think is at the least more unique and interesting, even if it's not very powerful. At one point, there was a hammer for the sword that would make your special crazy fast called Instant Nova. I abused the hell out of this thing in some early access versions because it was super overpowered for a while. Combine it with Double Nova and some special speed from Hermes and you were unstoppable. And if you slapped Athena's special boon on there, it made you nearly invincible since you were constantly reflecting in a 360-degree radius. For some reason, Athena actually gave the most damage out of all of the gods during this time. The sword's special animation during this time was quite different too, where using the special happened almost instantly but had a long cooldown afterward. It also features T-pose Zagreus. That's my favorite Zagreus. Then at another point in early access, the precursor to Dash Nova on the sword appeared, Snap Nova. And if you thought Dash Nova was nauseating, just try using the abomination that is Snap Nova. You could press the special button again soon after lunging with it to teleport back to your starting point. I guess the thought was to give your sword special some kind of strange ranged archetype? I'm not sure really. I will say that it was a pretty neat idea, but it really put a lot of strain on the camera and therefore our stomachs. This style of hammer for the sword actually saw quite a few iterations, but despite that, it never seemed to reach a place where people enjoyed it, unfortunately. There was another sword hammer during this time that would increase your crit chance right after using the special as well, called Empowering Nova. This might sound familiar, as the idea essentially became what is now Aspect of Nemesis. We actually have a few examples of this happening, such as the hammer for the rail called Invigorating Blast that eventually became what we now know as the Aspect of Eris. I really wish that I had tried it out back in early access, but I think I mostly ignored it. I have no doubt it was supremely overpowered back then. These hammers existed before aspects were released, so it makes sense as to why they're not in the game anymore. Also, before Delta Chamber existed for the rail, we had Infinity Chamber. There was no 3-round burst though, so this hammer was honestly boring. It definitely makes sense that they changed it up since hammers like Flurry Fire already existed, and Aspect of Zyruvias had recently been added to the game to give more ammo to the rail before even starting a run. And at one point you could actually get the Charged Volley hammer with the Aspect of Charon. Now, Charged Volley still exists in the game, but is no longer attainable when using Charon. But let me tell you, this thing was busted. You'd immediately be chunking any bosses as long as you had a decent special boon, and that's without even adding on the potential of getting a good second hammer like Concentrated Volley. In fact, when Hades launched in 1.0, Supergiant buffed the bow's base special damage a ton. I recall a conversation with the studio director around pick rates during this time, and he stated that Aspect of Charon seemed to be everyone's favorite. Thus, they rolled back a little bit of that buff, but it remained higher than it was pre-1.0. I guess I understand removing Charged Volley from Chiron's pool since it was probably an immediate take, but now that has kind of just been replaced by Concentrated Volley, so I don't know, what do you think? After Hermes was added to the game, Supergiant said that he would be the final god in Hades actually. But to our surprise, Demeter arrived a few patches later. So before Demeter existed, Hermes had a couple of boons that would actually slow down enemies. One was called Passing Through, which slowed enemies for a few seconds after dashing into them. And then you had the legendary called Relative Speed that would slow down enemies when you simply dashed near them. Both of these had diminished effects on bosses like Hades, so unfortunately it was kind of hard to tell if and when it was working. I don't think I really enjoyed these boons when they were in the game, so I'm definitely glad that they cut them. It also makes sense that they would steer Hermes away from this archetype when adding Demeter, who has a bunch of slow effects. Chaos used to have a lot more curses and boons as well. You could actually get a trap damage boon from them that would boost the amount of damage enemies would take from pillars, spikes, and explosive traps. Trap damage can actually get pretty crazy if you stack enough Stygian shards from the well, but that's pretty hard to do. It's hard to imagine a world where you'd want to take a trap damage boon from Chaos, since you'd be passing up on all the other potential Chaos boons, I'm afraid. Also, for the longest time, there was a curse that made you take damage whenever you dashed from Chaos. Not only was this curse just brutally harsh in the game, but it was also really annoying on your ears, since the curse sound effect would be constantly going off if you chose to ignore it. Let's be thankful that this one got tossed. Now, there was so much more that I'd like to cover here, but I think this is dense enough for one video. Let me know though if you'd like to see a part 2 including even more cut content. Special thanks to cgull, Zyruvias, and Pseudonym for helping me out with information and modding so that we could get all of the glorious footage for this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.